So I'll tell you, this hasn't happened to me, but I saw it online the other day. There are these two uniformed soldiers walking, and someone says, thank you for your service. And they say, oh, how kind of you. And then one of them turns their phone around and there's the tipping screen with the familiar blue boxes of 15%, 18%, 20%. The idea of tipping to thank folks for their service, I think kind of gets us to where a lot of Americans feel like we are in tipping culture in the United States today.
A new meaning of the service industry.
That's exactly right. This is Impromptu from Washington Post Opinions, a show that brings you conversations about the topics we can't stop thinking about. I'm Theodore Johnson, or Ted, a contributing columnist, and this week we're talking about tipping. The days of putting a dollar bill in a jar at the coffee shop now seem quaint, and Americans feel like more people are asking for tips. The patchwork of laws in different states with different surcharges is only making things more confusing. But of course, millions of Americans rely on tips to make ends meet, and now it's become a campaign issue. Both presidential candidates have proposed ending taxes on tips for service industry workers. So today we want to talk about what exactly we're tipping for, and does the whole system need a rethink? I'm joined by two of my colleagues to get into this.
I'm Heather Long. I focus on the economy as a columnist at the Post.
I'm Molly Roberts. I'm an editorial writer and columnist at the Post.
Okay, so maybe you've been in a scenario like this. You're picking up a cup of coffee, but you've decided to grab a few other things, a bag of coffee to take home, maybe that cool t-shirt you see hanging up. You go to pay, they flip the screen and give you suggestions for how much to tip. What's your response? Do you tip? Do you sort of shrug your shoulders? What do you guys do?
I panic and click one of the default options that charges me way too much and then feel silly about it all day. And I make sure not to tell my husband, who will make me feel even sillier for doing something like that.
Right. Same for you, Heather?
It's pretty similar. I think when in doubt in those situations, I will often enter a dollar. And it sort of goes back to that mentality of what would I have done if there were a tip jar there?
Yeah.
I might have thrown some extra change in. So you want to sort of acknowledge this is a great service or whatever. I'm glad you're my local coffee shop and I don't want you to close. So if I need to pay an extra dollar, here it is.
Right.
But you're right. You get flummoxed.
Yeah, I don't know if it's just me, but this tipping culture has made me want to avoid the impression of being cheap.
Yes.
I'll say one thing that's not the deepest thing. I think that the rise of the iPad has made a big difference in how we tip, because you were mentioning the tip jar beforehand. I think then it really felt like this individual judgment call, but having the screen turned toward you with the possible amounts limits the universe of reasonable tips, it feels like, from the perspective of the consumer. So I think that a lot of what's happening is you see a screen, it says the amounts you can tip. You could enter a custom amount, but that takes more time and you'd have to do more math. And then that kind of sets the standard.
Like, I'm Gen X, so when I was sort of raised in the world where you only tip the people that made a certain hourly wage, which is usually far, far below the minimum wage. I think $2 and change is the current number now. So I thought with tipping was supposed to bolster the income of those who don't even make minimum wage. And many workers today make below that minimum wage because of this system. Now, do you think the system makes sense, or should service be built into the cost of things? That is, should tipping be a separate line item that the customer adds, or should it be built into the check and where customers don't have to worry about this stuff anymore?
It's a really good question, Ted. And you're right. It's $2.13 an hour still for restaurant workers. And I published an op-ed a few years ago by someone who was tipped $0, nothing, by a large party that had come in to her restaurant. And they wrote something terrible like "God bless you," instead of a tip, and
right.
That's priceless.
Yeah, and she posted on Reddit, and it got tons of responses, as you might imagine. But she wrote this powerful op-ed that was like, "Look, tipping is how waiters get paid." And so you're right, Ted. Fundamentally, I don't think that we have a tipping problem. We have a wage problem still in this country, at least for a lot of these service professions. It's gotten a little better. We did see a lot of lower end wages go up during the pandemic. People recognize the value of everything from the grocery store worker to the restaurant delivery service and whatnot. But now we're kind of in this limbo phase where we're not still in a health pandemic, but you're right. What do you do in these circumstances? And I think Molly had done a beautiful job in her recent editorial of kind of laying out 3 different categories. One where you must tip is the restaurant worker. We all know that they're not getting paid. There's only 5 or 6 states that require that the person has to at least make minimum wage per hour. Like some states don't even require that. So if it's a slow afternoon and you're working the shift and you don't actually make, the $12 or whatever your state minimum wage is per hour, you've lost out and there's nothing to fix that. And that's a really terrible place to be in the United States of America.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think what's weird right now is, it may be true, in an ideal world, there wouldn't be any tipping. Everybody would just make the standard minimum wage. There would be no such thing as a sub-minimum wage. But today, it's just a complete mess. You were mentioning how you pretty much knew, Ted, when you were growing up, who was making the sub-minimum wage. I think now we really don't,
That's
especially as various states, various cities are passing laws that make it so that many of the restaurant workers aren't making a sub-minimum wage anymore. There's a strange tension now where on the one hand, we are legally, in practice, trying to eliminate tipping, eliminate the sub-minimum wage. But then on the other hand, culturally, there's more and more pressure to tip started, I think, in the pandemic.
Yeah. So I lived in Japan for a little while in the military. There, not only was tipping not practiced, it was discouraged. It was frowned upon. The idea was, we have entered this economic contract. You've come into McDonald's. You've come to buy this thing. We're going to sell you the thing at the price it is. Nothing changes. If you've come into a upper scale restaurant or a hotel, you have paid for what we are selling. And that's the end of the transaction. And so I'm curious what you guys think what tipping is for. Again, we've sort of talked about it bolstering the wages of those who don't make minimum wage, who have this sort of special wage class for the job. But as that sort of eroded some and tipping is everywhere, what are we tipping? Is it for exceptional service? Is it an act of kindness? Is it just social pressure because we don't want to be seen as the cheapskate in society? What does tipping come to represent in America today?
All of the above. I think that really what it is we tip when we feel that there's a disparity between what we value something at and what the market, society values something at. So that might be the sub-minimum wage, or that might be minimum wage. Think of a hotel maid, for example, but that's really not enough. And this is really work that very few people want to be doing. And hey, if we're staying in the nice hotel, we probably value that more and we can afford it. Or the above and beyond service. Say the wage is good, but it's a locksmith, and the locksmith came really late at night and stayed for 2 hours, and it was really cold and their hands got numb, but they got me in my house. They may make a good amount of money, but I still value that more even than that amount, because otherwise I would have been out in the cold.
I think that's right, Molly. Personally, I honestly wish it was just built into the price, similar to what you were describing in Japan, or there's a diner that I order from a lot, and they actually just add 20% on for everybody. Like you can go in and sort of verbally opt out, but almost no one does, and people sort of appreciate knowing, okay, this is the standard amount. I was reading up on the economic research, and it's interesting. A lot of places have actually found that diners or that people using the service prefer if there's a transparent charge that's like service charge. They may grumble about it, but they prefer that to this confusion around what do I do when somebody's thrusting all those different options in my face and I really don't know what's expected here. And so people have come to like service charge or whatever.
Right. Look, I thought 15% was the norm. And then somehow became 18, then 20. I've seen as high as 25% on those screens. And I will admit that I didn't even know it was customary to tip like the folks who clean your room in a hotel. And so I guess I want to get a sense from you two on how society or the service industries and beyond have determined what the right percentages are. I don't know how that is communicated. How do we learn what is, the proper way to engage in tipping culture? And I guess I'm very curious about the social part of it.
It is complicated. I was personally aghast when I saw the data on who tips for Uber and Lyft type rides. And I think maybe the three of us are unusual in that I think we've all described how we feel a little guilt-tripped into tipping. But if you look or listen to Uber and Lyft drivers, they'll tell you that basically around only a third of customers tip at all.
Wow.
And so basically, and within that third, a lot of people are doing like a buck or two, kind of what we've described. I'm going to give you something, but I don't really know. And then there's like a small group, it depends by city or by driver, but let's say, 10 to 20% who are like the big tippers. They're clicking the 25% or the 20%, Ted, that you were describing, but it's actually a really small fraction of people who are doing that. I will say I do think in the United States, we either need a total revolution around the restaurant workers, or we all need to be tipping them because that is ingrained. It's a little bit more nebulous in what I would classify as other service workers. What do you do if you had a house cleaning? Do you tip every time? That's kind of the rideshare falls into that nebulous category of generally people see it as optional. And then there's this whole third category of stuff, like you were saying, where you're like, wait, I'm supposed to be tipping here.
Right, exactly.
And that's like the coffee shop and those sorts of things that are just rapidly growing.
Okay, I want to talk about the politics of tipping and whether there's any good way to change the system. But first, let's take a quick break. Welcome back. I'm Ted Johnson, and this is Impromptu. Okay, so both Vice President Kamala Harris, the Democratic nominee for president, and former President Donald Trump, the Republican nominee, have announced doing away with taxes on tips. Do you guys think that's going to help anything?
Gosh, it's a tricky one. I mean, it's on tax policy, it makes very little sense. And sort of the ideas have been widely panned from that perspective, and this notion that, in America, we all pay taxes on our income. But I do think it was striking. Trump is very open that he got this idea literally from a waiter in Las Vegas who came up and tried to talk to him about it. And I think it goes back to what we've been talking about so far on this entire podcast, which is there are times when these tipped workers who are supposedly supposed to be earning all this money from tips are not. And so I think that this person was trying to solve a very practical problem. Last week they were fine and they made, a couple $100 that week and it was good. And this week nobody tipped and they didn't make that and they have to pay their bills too. And so that's why they were looking for a way to basically fix the wage problem. I think it's like a bad way to fix it, but I think we have to understand that mentality.
Yeah, I mean, I think I see it as a bad idea. I think it seems like a pandering play for Nevada. But I do think it raises interesting questions, what you were just saying, Heather, about what makes servers better off. On the one hand, the variability in, say, weekly or monthly pay that comes from relying on tips is a negative as a service worker. On the other hand, I think there are a lot of servers who don't want tips to be gotten rid of because you might have a steadier income, but you might end up making less. You get paid the minimum wage, but then whatever tips come in on top of that, I think the federal law says can then be redistributed throughout the restaurant to back of house as well. And then that may end up leaving you taking home less as a server. So that seems like a policy complication.
Yeah. And so, Heather, can I ask you I'm curious with these policy discussions, how the government knows how much a person has been tipped.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's evolved over time. So yes, if it's done through any technological device, then the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, will definitely know about it. Restaurants and servers are supposed to report tips in cash. Mm-hmm. There's a long debate about whether that happens.
Right.
The answer is yes, all tips are supposed to be reported. No, all tips are not.
Right.
But as with technology, we have a pretty good idea of what people should be earning week to week.
Okay, so in y'all's opinion, is the tipping system broken and maybe we should do away with it altogether like other nations? And do we need to rethink the whole thing? Or is there a solution aside from, just, okay, we're not going to tax it, which does, I admit, does seem a bit of like a political play. But is there a kind of way to reform tipping culture?
I think the only way to make it totally simple would be to pay everybody at least a minimum wage and then ban tipping. Because as long as tipping is not banned, people are going to be doing it, and there are going to be confusing social pressures around it. There are going to be weirdnesses about where we do and don't do it. I don't know that that would be better, but I will argue confidently that that would be simpler.
Similar to Molly, I'm to the point now where I wish, as I outlined earlier, that there was just, the 20% service charge or whatever, some sort of built-in charge at every restaurant, and that it was ensuring that everyone not just makes minimum wage. Let's be honest, federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour still in most states.
Yeah.
Like, I would like to know that my person is making a heck of a lot more than that. The reality is, if you look at job data, most people begin their job search wanting at least $20 an hour. Now, you can debate if the teenager should be getting that and blah, blah, blah. But I think we need to be honest that $7.25 an hour doesn't make you feel a whole lot better than $2.13 an hour.
Right. Okay, so we're going to wrap up. I'd love if each of you would share a general takeaway from this conversation, from the policy conversation happening, just from your own experiences. What's sort of your big takeaway from this?
My big takeaway is there clearly are no rules, no hard and fast answers. Mm-hmm. And I suppose that means that I will try to keep in mind that I should tip when it feels right to me, shouldn't tip when it doesn't feel right to me, and that there's really no chance I'm doing it wrong because there is no right.
That's right.
I think one of the things that's really struck me, is it really needs to be a national policy. I mean, we're having this conversation, some of us in Washington, D.C., which has a different policy than surrounding Virginia and Maryland and state law. And it can get really confusing really fast, even when you're trying to do the right thing. So I hope there is some sort of reform at the national level sometime. And I just want to shake people who don't tip at all for their Uber and Lyft driver.
Right.
That just really, really shocks me.
With that, we're going to wrap up. Heather, Molly, thank you both for being a part of this episode of Impromptu, and we should definitely do this again soon.
Do we have to tip you? Tip you 10%, Ted? We'll Venmo you.
So very soon you will see a prompt pop up on your screen. 20, 25, and 30% will be the options.
I will enter in $1 in the custom menu field.
I was going to do 50 cents, Molly. We better coordinate.
I will put you both on social media, and we'll let you deal with the fallout. Before you go, here's a take from our humor columnist, Alexandra Petri.
My one solid theory about tipping is that cow tipping is a scam. Where are the TikToks? If it's real, where are the TikToks? You never meet someone who says, I personally tipped a cow. You always meet people who say, my friend did it. I once called the National Zoo and asked them if I could try to tip their cow for science and make sure the cow was not harmed. And they never followed up with me. But my offer stands. I would do my best not to harm the cow. I'm getting word now from our producer that this is not the kind of tipping we're talking about. My understanding is that you're supposed to tip if it's a day ending with Y and you've made a purchase using currency. If the screen says so, I panic, I comply. I am frighteningly compliant, though. I'm constantly failing the Milgram experiment test. I always brush for the full 2 minutes prescribed by my electric toothbrush. Say no to the tip screen? I can't even tell my electric toothbrush that I have more important places to be. That's how I am. Once the screens came out with the option to tip, I was just like, well, I guess coffee is $6 now. I have one specific bone to pick within the land of tipping. Domino's has an incredibly effective ad about how tipping is out of control. At Domino's, the ad goes, we know there's a lot of pressure to tip these days. Everywhere you go, there's a tip screen. They show you the grocery line, the gym, even you're efficient at the altar. And then the ad concludes like this. At a time when tipping can feel thankless,
Domino's wants to say,
thanks for the tip.
By tipping you back. Tip your Domino's driver $3 or more online and we'll tip you $3 to use on next week's order. Only at Domino's.
No! Do you not hear yourself, ad? Never have I seen someone so beautifully diagnose the problem and then come up with so baffling a solution. Why not say, at Domino's, we pay our drivers a living wage, so there's no need to tip. We're the one place where you're safe from tipping. Instead of now, I'm being tipped for tipping? Hot tip, there's too much tipping, so now we're going to tip you for tipping. This is what broke me. This ad. When we look back and ask, what did it? It was this. This was my tipping point. But who am I kidding? Everywhere these days is the tipping point.
This episode was produced by Hadley Robinson, edited by Demir Marusik, Chris Sullentrop, and Allison Michaels, and mixed by Emma Munger. Chris Rucan designed our art. Special thanks to Millie Mitra and Deirdre Byrne. Thanks for listening to Impromptu. Please let us know what you thought of today's show by emailing impromptu@washedpost.com.